Hello, my name is Patrick Mockridge. Today's Monday, the 5th of October 2020, and this is the second part of my talk on the current state of crypto and Bitcoin and what have you. Okay, let's get into it. So, yeah, the series is called Reducing Competition for the Serial Channels of Belonging, Bitcoin Modeled as White Noise, and the Radical Parallelization of Work in the 21st Century. Part 2 starts to introduce what I've called Romeo-Juliet diagrams, and we begin to unlock the beginnings of a game and how we can interact with networks with a game theory mindset. Okay, so last time we introduced a little bit of process calculus. So parallelness is when things can happen independently from one another on separate channels. Serialness is when information needs to be processed on the same channel sequentially. Okay, and we went over why serialness can be good, but also from a project management perspective, it creates critical paths which are coordination bottlenecks. Okay, and humanity has a tendency to over serialize and create artificial bottlenecks, and then essentially create roadblocks and collect rents from these roadblocks from a coordination perspective. Okay, so we went over this kind of what I've called 0 to 1 process calculus, okay, where people agree that they want something in the green square, okay, then people try to make that happen on the yellow square. Okay, on the red square we introduce predictive capability, and then when the predictive capability is locked in, that almost sort of automatically serializes the path to the blue square. Okay, and here we have PayPal as one example. Okay, Airbnb is another one. You know, the difference between Airbnb and Craigslist is this kind of anti-fraud and measures and predictive capability. This, okay, so you know, part 1 we went over this, what I've termed a sequestration channel. This is the most obvious one, from green to blue. It's the one people trip themselves up on the most. Okay, but we're gonna start uncovering 2 more sequestration channels that are important. Okay, and to kind of ease us into this story a little bit, I have a nice story about ROS Industrial, which is the robotic operating system created for real-world commercial manufacturing projects. Okay, the robotic operating system itself is an open source library of software components that people can download to easily create robotic prototypes, and it's used a lot by amateurs and by academia, and it's a great thing. Okay, but Shawn Edwards, CTO of Plus One Robotics in San Antonio, Texas, took it to a next level by making it fit for commercial business. Okay, and it's really great for his business, great for a lot of SMEs. There's a lot of things to like about it. Okay, and we could be forgiven for thinking that ROS Industrial followed this sort of 0 to 1 process calculus path. Okay, that we described in the previous lecture. Okay, but that's not exactly what happened. Okay, so, and in order to understand this a bit, I'm going to introduce 2 more bad patterns or sequestration patterns. Okay, and the matrix goes deeper than Care Bears. Okay, there's a bit more to this. Okay, so there's the hyper-financialisation sequestration path. Okay, this is what Elizabeth Holmes did. Okay, and it starts out with someone raising a bit of money and then having some sort of idea as to how to make more, and this is where people are super focused on series A, B, C, D, you know, like eventually getting to IPO, you know, getting those big public valuations, and the kind of engineering and what goes on behind it is an afterthought. So, you know, Elizabeth Holmes had all these ideas. I think she's kind of clinically a psychopath probably, and she sort of had all these claims that she could do all these things, but she could never really follow them through. And that's the worst example, but there's, there's other ones like WeWork is another example that is very similar to this, okay? And then the problem with ROS Industrial is it follows this other sort of sequestration path from green to red, okay? And this is sort of common amongst engineers to be sequestered like this. And I'm not having a dig at Shawn at all. I think ROS Industrial is a really, really great thing. But if we're talking about collective intelligence, Industry 4.0, all this kind of stuff, the people in the green square need to find their own sense of belonging. Okay, they can't kind of have their belonging found for them. That's a little bit like slavery, in my opinion. And we could say, well, so what? This is all part of the game. But with new technology available today, I think we can do a bit better than this, personally. But anyway, ROS Industrial was a pro gamer move from Shawn Edwards. To give a bit more background, the enterprise software for robotics has many sort of burdensome licenses and terms of what you can and can't do with it. And every time Shawn was going through his development iteration cycles, he was having to speak to lawyers, okay, and then discuss with his developer team what the lawyers said they could and couldn't do. And you can imagine how burdensome this can be for your kind of development iteration cycle. So Shawn just scrapped all that and made a core ROS library that was open source. Anyone could use it, and it was fit for commercial applications. And it just, it sped up his development timelines so much, and not just for him, but for other businesses too. And ROS Industrial does prove a very important thing, that open source engineering can hold its own in the enterprise market. And that's not just in silicon, but in terms of things with actuators that actuate into the real world. And ROS Industrial kind of is the most important, I think, open source framework that breaks through into the meat space, okay? But in order to harness collective intelligence properly, everyone needs to belong, especially the contributing engineers. And the way ROS Industrial works, the contributing engineers don't get anything, okay? The membership fees for ROS Industrial are used to do admin and further sales, and nothing goes back to the engineers. And it's entirely possible that a contributing engineer to ROS Industrial could be working in an Amazon warehouse to put food on the table next to a robot that's he's helped design, okay? And this kind of thing can't continue, okay? So combining these bad patterns, we kind of begin to see what's kind of going on in real life, I think, is that you have this financial system that's just wholly kind of focused on itself and is self-referential, okay? And then engineers being sequestered into projects in the background to almost act as a gold backing or some kind of hard currency backing to this paper money thing that's going on down the right hand side. And this is kind of a soft slavery, and we need to, especially our engineers, we need to be doing a lot better than this for them, in my opinion, okay? And if we add on top the kind of zero-sum game mimetic office politics thing on top, okay, it's just horrible. It's just so inefficient. So we can kind of see how this happens, given, this starts to make a bit more sense, given those other two sequestration channels, okay? And, I would argue that the last ICO bubble was a story of these two sequestration channels, okay? So you had this kind of pump and dump thing here going on the right, and then this kind of community engagement thing going on the left, and never did the two really come into contact with each other until Wojak ends up at McDonald's. Okay, so that model is not going to give rise to insurable events. And I said last week, this is more what we want. It's sort of sense of belonging that allows us to kind of fight back against this stuff and create our own place in the world. Okay, so again, Facebook is a kind of an example of this double sequestration. In 2007, Facebook's users were its customers. In 2020, Facebook's users are its product. It sequestered the users to generate predictive capability from them, which it sells. And then in 2007, Mark Zuckerberg was just a kind of not high school dropout, Harvard dropout with a nice idea, and now he's some kind of like evil alien overlord archetype. So, and then to sort of get back to ROS Industrial, with this sequestration pattern down the left, even Shawn Edwards himself is not gaining the full capitalization from what he's done. Shawn Edwards is part of Jeff Bezos' supply chain. So it's really Jeff Bezos who capitalizes upon this ROS Industrial stuff. And this kind of further cements inequality, in my opinion. And I think we need to sort of get back to looking at what open source is really for. It provides free validation and a lot of kind of open information, but it can only be capitalized upon via sequestration. In order to fully capitalize upon any idea, you need to be able to protect the secrets of it. And if you can't, if it's just there in the open, then the only way it can be capitalized upon is if someone else comes along and sequesters it for their own purposes. And therefore I would argue that kind of open source is acting counterproductively to cement economic inequality and sequestration of predictive capability, and therefore kind of raw power. And why is this so hard? Well, the thing is, people talk about the value of networks being proportional to the square of the sum of the nodes. This is Metcalfe's law, and they argue that this is why we should build networks, over and above hierarchies. But this is fine if the Metcalfe effects of the network are good, but if the Metcalfe effects of the network are bad, you're going to get negative n squared value. Basically like a giant shit in the sky landing on your head. And that's kind of what the internet has become in 2020, in my opinion. And we aren't like designing our networks, our value networks, very well. It's all very kind of disjointed, and they aren't allowing individuals to retain value, as well as they allow the value that individuals create to be sequestered by third parties for their own ends. So, but the good thing about modeling things as networks is, people talk about hierarchy versus network and which is better and what's worse, but according to these Romeo-Juliet diagrams I'll get on to in a minute, it doesn't really matter. You can just kind of model all this stuff you don't like as like a passive rent seeker, or some kind of bad actor, stationary bandit, and the aim here really is to kind of stop us arguing, because arguing is just competing over a serialized channel. Really, what we really need to do is allow people to reveal their incentives and allow more space to get more kind of Steve Wozniak people live without asking them to be something that they're not. It's very different being a pure deep thinking engineer to being someone who's kind of socially competitive. They're very different personality traits and character traits, and we can't expect people to be both. Diego Gambetta wrote this book, Codes of the Underworld, which is all about mafia economics, and at the start of this talk, I was going to try and go into it very deeply, but really I don't need to. All you need to understand is that, anyone who's selling a product that is viewed as contraband or is viewed as kind of socially negative, they're not going to tell you that that's what they're selling. They're going to tell you they're selling something else, okay? And that's kind of what Facebook does today. It's kind of what I would argue most people do today, to be honest. But we don't, all we need to say is that if someone's doing something bad or they're selling something bad, they're not going to openly say that that's what they're selling. Okay, that's all we need to consider here. This open source stuff, in my opinion, it was used as a band-aid for a long time, and we're now starting to over-rely upon it and use it for things that it's not really capable of doing. Okay. It's kind of like if all you have is a hammer, everything looks like a nail. We're saying like more open source, more community engagement stuff. But our R&D processes in the West started to break down in the 1980s. Okay, and then Steve Jobs famously kind of pilfered all the stuff from Xerox Computers R&D labs to create Apple computers and the iMac and all this stuff. Okay, but since then we've said open source is the way to go. But you can't capitalize upon it, so it's going to lead to inequality. Okay, so we all as a West society have this expectation of innovation, but then we're not kind of prepared to like roll our sleeves up and do what's necessary to make the R&D happen anymore, I would argue. And then we just sort of invent these ideas like collective intelligence when they're just essentially naked sequestration of other people's ideas, and then we kind of hyper normalize it and say that's okay, but no one's really sitting down from first principles and thinking, is this the way we should be doing things? And I think open source has kind of got to the stage where it's mostly maxed out, and we can't, if we're really serious about doing all this kind of industry 4.0 type stuff, open source is not the way to go. Okay. And the other thing is, Steve Wozniak and Steve Jobs are two completely different people, and it's the synergies of different kinds of people operating in parallel that create the magic. Okay, expecting, Steve Jobsniak is not a real person. Having this kind of like Sheldon engineer blackface acting up thing on TV. As a way, and to me, I think it's just a way to kind of belittle engineers. Sheldon will never be cool, and if the expectation that Sheldon will ever be cool is a prerequisite of kind of genuine economic participation and personal development and interaction with networks, then we're basically dooming ourselves to failure. I think we need to be more mature and accept that people are different. Okay, and we need different kinds of people working in synergy to create the magic that we expect. Okay, so Siren servers, these are servers that sequester information to create, to kind of sequester your predictive capability and use it against you. Okay, this is created off the back of social media, but engineers don't need social media. Okay, engineers just need to benefit from Reed's law, which is creating subgroups within a network that have value to the engineer. Okay, this kind of Metcalfe thing, it's good for those who own the network, but it's not necessarily good for the users of the network. And engineers don't need to go advertising their life on the internet either. They just need to signal to the network that they're competent and that they're capable of quality assuring work. They're capable of originating, checking documents, things like that. They don't need to be taking pictures of their steak dinner for their followers. It's two different worlds, and we're trying to merge two different worlds, and we're not getting good outcomes. So, in order to build a cogent and coherent network for engineers, I think blockchain's the way to go, because it can maximize this Reed's law, this ability of the individual to create subgroups within the network, while minimizing Metcalfe value sequestration by Siren servers, because it's decentralized and the encryption is tightly controlled. And this essentially boils down to a signaling theory problem, which is kind of very similar to a cryptography problem, but it kind of a bit more subtle. Okay. So, reframing the blockchain problem, instead of saying blockchain is for money or blockchain is for creating new social networks, I would argue that, blockchain is for having on-chain info that should maximize Reed's law for innovators, designers, and builders, and maximize their Metcalfe value as individuals connected to other valuable nodes to them, okay? While minimizing sequestration from kind of hackers, bad actors, Siren servers, and just generally people acting against the interests of the constructive people, okay? And the hypothesis here is that engineers can signal their competence to the network enough to make an insurable digital reputation, while minimizing kind of all this bad stuff we talked about before, okay? So why engineers? They are oracles by the strictest definition. Their signature is insurable. If an engineer signs on the dotted line on a document, that's hard predictive capacity that says either that thing you're going to build will work or won't, depending upon the recommendations of the engineer, okay? This is why we spend so long educating them and developing them, because their signatures are really, really valuable to us as a society, okay? So, and if people are talking about doing financial derivatives on the blockchain where banks get to hide the systemic risks of the instruments they're trading from the public, while maximizing the financial gain, well, certainly we could kind of, instead of doing that for the financial system, why can't we do that for people who aren't destroying the world, okay? And in my opinion, the purpose of the blockchain is to create oracles of us all where we all belong, okay? And we as individuals claim the reward for our kind of situational and technical awareness and experience and understanding, okay? And then on our 0 to 1 process calculus path, okay, the signaling pathways should be secured from those acting against our interests. So we should be revealing information and acting according to an end goal that is serialized and capitalized and live, okay? So we already went over the fact that this is happening and this is happening, okay? But now we're gonna introduce the cast of characters, and this is all just signaling theory, information theory. Alice, Bob, and Carol they're the three nice people, okay? Mallory is the malicious hacker, the bad guy. Oscar is Mallory's opponent, okay? He's kind of good guy. Let's call him the good guy for now, okay? Eve is an eavesdropper, and Sybil is a reputation hacker, okay? Sybil's gonna spoof different IDs, try and sort of pretend to be the government or an engineering institution or whatever, in order to attack you, essentially, okay? So this is the Romeo-Juliet diagram, okay? And in part 3, we'll kind of get into a bit more why this is called a Romeo-Juliet diagram, okay? For now, just accept it as a nice name, okay? And this same map from before has now become a game, okay? And Oscar is here on the green square, okay? His opponent is Mallory, okay? And as a worst case, Mallory starts with n squared resources, okay? N being the number of nodes in the network in which you're operating in. And as a worst case, sort of Mallory is the most sort of malicious Siren server imaginable, okay? And then Eve is an eavesdropper, and Sybil is a reputational attacker, okay? And these two actors could work for either Oscar or Mallory. Okay, they kind of make their decisions based on what Oscar or Mallory have to give them at the time. Okay, but at the start they're going to be working for Mallory exclusively, okay, because Mallory has all the resources and Oscar doesn't have any, okay. Oscar is now sort of Alice in Wonderland, and he's good guy Alice, and he wants to send a message to good guy Bob on the yellow square there, according to our 0 to 1 process calculus first move. Okay, and this is because Oscar or Alice or what have you needs to be able to secure resources to defend himself from Sybil attacks here and just sort of nasty sequestration type attacks on this diagonal here. Okay, so we'll leave it there for now. It does get very interesting in the third talk, but in the first two talks we banished the reptilians from Saturn and the global conspiracies and all that stuff, all the kind of politics of who to blame, all the scapegoats. We can just put all that in the bin now and just label that as Mallory. Okay, Mallory is whoever is operating on a network acting against our interests. Okay, same with hierarchies. They're just rent seekers on serialized channels. Okay, essentially the same thing. They're just someone else acting against your interests. Okay, and then anything else you just think is bad is Mallory. And Nietzsche said, God is dead, we killed him, but God is dead, long live God. That's what I say. So while Oscar's predicament seems terrible, he has nothing and his opponent has everything. Actually, by analyzing these moves in part 3, we'll start to see how the situational capital of the different squares starts to become important, because Mallory needs to convert her highly serialized live currency into the currency in which Oscar is operating in order to attack him. Okay, and Oscar can actually arbitrage his way through this, or at least start to. So that's my presentation anyway. Thank you for listening again. Any comments, please leave them below, and I'll be back with part 3 probably later this week.